Good afternoon. This is Friday, April 30th, 2010, and the poet Martín Espada and I, Professor Orlando Menés, are here at the Julián Samora Library for an interview. And I want to say hello to our viewers, listeners. And first, I want you to start off the interview by reading one of your poems. Could you read that one poem that you would say is your legacy? The one that you would like to leave for the world, for God himself to hear?
Well, that's a little bit like picking one of your children as your favorite.
Yeah. Can you do that?
Okay. I'll try. Actually, I think I can do this without the glasses. This is a poem called Alabanza, which means praise in Spanish. Alabanza in praise of Local 100 for the 43 members of hotel employees and restaurant employees, Local 100, working at the Windows on the World restaurant, who lost their lives in the attack on the World Trade Center. Alabanza. Praise the cook with a shaven head and a tattoo on his shoulder that said, Oye, a blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fajardo, the harbor of pirates centuries ago. Praise the lighthouse in Fajardo, candle glimmering white to worship the dark saint of the sea. Alabanza. Praise the cook's yellow pirate's cap, worn in the name of Roberto Clemente, his plane that flamed into the ocean loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes. Alabanza. Praise the kitchen radio, dial clicked even before the dial on the oven, so that music and Spanish rose before bread. Praise the bread. Alabanza. Praise Manhattan from 107 flights up, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. Praise the great windows where immigrants from the kitchen could squint and almost see their world, hear the chant of nations. Ecuador, Mexico, República Dominicana, Haiti, Yemen, Ghana, Bangladesh. Alabanza. Praise the kitchen in the morning where the gas burned blue on every stove and exhaust fans fired their diminutive propellers, hands cracked eggs with quick thumbs or sliced open cartons to build an altar of cans. Alabanza. Praise the busboy's music, the chime of his dishes and silverware in the tub. Alabanza. Praise the dish dog, the dishwasher who worked that morning because another dishwasher could not stop coughing, or because he needed overtime to pile the sacks of rice and beans for a family floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs. Alabanza. Praise the waitress who heard the radio in the kitchen and sang to herself about a man gone. Alabanza. After the thunder, wilder than thunder, after the shudder deep in the glass of the great windows, after the radio stopped singing like a tree full of terrified frogs, after night burst the dam of day and flooded the kitchen. For a time the stoves glowed in darkness, like the lighthouse in Fajardo, like a cook's soul. Soul, I say, even if the dead cannot tell us about the bristles of God's beard, because God has no face. Soul, I say, to name the smoke beings flung in constellations across the night sky of this city and cities to come. Alabanza, I say, even if God has no face. Alabanza. When the war began, from Manhattan and Kabul, two constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance, we have no music here." And the other said with a Spanish tongue, "I will teach you, music is all we have."
Thank you, Martin, for this moving reading. Many have described, and I think rightly, your poetry, this piece as well, and many others, as poetry of advocacy, as poetry of witness. It is also a poetry of song. And I just hearing your poem was picking out the anapestic lines that you have, and very skillful. This is the kind of question that our students would be interested in, is what compelled you to be this kind of advocate, as you put it sometimes, in poetry, through song, rather than through prose, through a polemics in prose?
Well, I think you hit on the key word, which is polemics. I think for me personally, and I'm not alone here, that it's easy when you're writing nonfiction prose or even fiction to yield to excess when it comes to polemics. One of the things I try to do with my poetry is remember that it is the art of the concise. That I'm trying to use only the words that are absolutely necessary to tell the tale. That includes a sense of the musicality of the piece, which brings me to my second point in response to your question, that I believe we have to move people in order to change their hearts and minds, that it is not enough to make a reasoned argument. The reasoned argument is necessary but not sufficient. We also have to be able to move people. We have to be able to raise the hairs on the back of the neck or on the arm. We have to leave them with a sense in their nerve endings that something is happening or something should happen. And music, song, poetry has a way of reaching people that way, and in that sense. In many cases, I think, appeals to a common humanity and is able to circumvent many of the walls that we've put up to keep out communication with other human beings.
And to go along with what you said, I'm thinking of one of the great polemical poems in the English language, William Blake's London. I cannot find a more eloquent piece on the corruption, destruction of the human soul and the human body than that poem. I think that it's a poem that I myself recite to myself all the time. Here we have an advocate, and I think in your poetry as well, where the speaker is a kind of poet-prophet. Not the poet, but the speaker is a kind of poet-prophet, someone who is inspired through an apprehension of the ecstatic possibilities of what it means to be human, and creates a compressed song, a compressed chant that mesmerizes, that reaches deeper into the mind than just words in an essay. What do you think about that?
I know that poem very well, and I know Blake, and he is one of the poets that I return to when I want the sense of the ecstatic that you're talking about. Of course, I'm more directly connected to two other poets who have found the sense of ecstatic possibility, and one is Walt Whitman, and the other is Pablo Neruda. And I see them as my twin pillars, but Blake also appeals to me a great deal. And for him to walk through the streets of his London at that time and And to have that sense of ecstatic possibility just demonstrates the kind of visionary he was. There are other ways of looking at the same phenomenon and other vocabulary we can use to describe it. I sometimes think of myself as a pragmatic utopian. And that obviously is oxymoronic. But I take as a point of departure what Eduardo Galeano wrote about utopia, where he basically characterized utopia as a dot on the horizon, and the speaker in that piece keeps moving towards this dot on the horizon, and the dot runs 10 steps for every 10 steps he takes. So finally he asks himself, what good is utopia? That's what. It's good for walking. In other words, as we walk towards ecstatic possibility, we make progress that was unthinkable in previous generations or previous centuries. I am reminded of the fact that in my grandfather's day, my grandfather was born in 1890, right? So my grandfather's day, and my grandfather came to adulthood, there are so many things that were considered impossible and only the province of dreamers, right? You know, segregation in the South, lynching, polio, the 8-hour workday. It goes on and on and on. You know, we dwell in a taken-for-granted reality. And all we have to do is look at the example of history to see that we are simply limited by what we imagine to be possible. Because things which are impossible or considered impossible 100 years ago or even 50 years ago are no longer. And the classic example, the one that jumps out at everyone in the present day, is the election of an African-American president, Barack Obama. My father went to jail at the age of 19 in Biloxi, Mississippi for refusing to go to the back of the bus. And my father, among many others, never dreamed that he would see the election of an African-American president during his lifetime, right? And so the fact that that was achieved with all of the constrictions and limitations that come with it. There's plenty we can say about the presidency itself. But the fact that we collectively achieved that in November of 2008 speaks volumes about ecstatic possibilities.
And to go along with what you said about Obama, I'm also myself recalling how he had Elizabeth Alexander giving her poem, her inauguration poem. And I wanted to ask you, is poetry necessary for this kind of change to develop in human beings? I mean, is poetry necessary, or is it just ancillary?
I think poetry is necessary. I think, first of all, we have to do two things. We have to define poetry more broadly and understand that poetry also includes not only what we put on the page, but it includes what's in the air, it includes spoken word, it includes rap, hip-hop, it includes popular song, it includes all kinds of things. We have to keep all of that under the rubric or umbrella of poetry. But more to the point, I think that poetry is something that we have over the years belittled, mocked, and minimalized. You know, we are constantly mocking our own effectiveness, and there's this pose in the poetry community of detached hip irony, you know, and along with that comes the notion that, you know, to use Auden's phrase, poetry makes nothing happen. Now, I mean, Auden knew that wasn't true, and many of Auden's poems make something happen. But that has been taken out of context and misused so many times to defend the apathy of so much contemporary poetry in the United States. You know, it's amazing to me how so many poets can defend their apathy and indifference with such great fury and passion. If they put half that energy into the poems themselves, the world would look very different. But poetry is necessary because poetry can do things to the discourse, the popular and the public discourse that can't happen any other way. You know, I mentioned before this sense of being able to move people, the sense of being able to touch people at the core, in a way that a political speech ordinarily, with few exceptions, would not be able to do. So I think that we can't forget that's part of it. I think we do fall into a trap, though, which is the trap of trying to quantify the impact of a poem on the world. Right? We set a very high standard for so-called political poems. If a political poem doesn't end the war, therefore it failed as a poem. And of course that's ludicrous. Why should one poem, or even a group, a book, an anthology of political poems, end the war by itself? It is part of it's one contribution to a much larger mosaic. And ultimately what I feel is when I write a poem of witness or a poem of advocacy or a political poem, what I'm doing is I put that energy into the stratosphere. I put that poem into the air where it can be breathed in by others, and it becomes part of that atmosphere of ideas that we live in, and hopefully it will make some sort of difference. But I don't lay awake at night trying to figure out whether it's a 2% or 3% or 4% impact on the universe. We have to stop quantifying or trying to quantify the impact of poems on the world. Instead, I take as an article of faith what a professor of mine at the University of Wisconsin, Herbert Hill, used to say. Herbert Hill used to say, simply, ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. And I think that was a profound statement. And imagine now if those ideas have music, and those ideas have imagery. That's what a poem should do.
And I'm recalling right now, when you mentioned Auden, his poem Musée de Beaux Arts, and how that poem, for me in particular, allows me to enter that difficult time of the 30s in a way that is political, but also through the back door of the imagination. It's tangential to that time in a sense, but also it speaks eloquently about that time tersely.
Well, sometimes a poem of advocacy or a poem of witness has to wait for its historical moment. I think now of another English poet, Wilfred Owen. And Wilfred Owen, of course, as we know, wrote some of the most brilliant war poems or anti-war poems in the English language of the 20th century. They were not received as such when they were published. Of course, posthumously, immediately after his death in the First World War. And you know, his friends, Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, are trying to get his poems into the world. They were largely ignored and denigrated as the poetry of a coward until the 1960s. Two things happened. Benjamin Britten adapted some of those poems for his war requiem, and Vietnam occurred. The war took shape. And those who opposed the war in Vietnam took great comfort from the prophet called Wilfred Owen.
So to write great poetry of advocacy, of witness, at least as much as one can write such a poem, entails risk.
Risk, and perhaps a bit of luck in that you hope it will stay in print or be available, you know, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. That's becoming, with the technology we have at our disposal, more and more viable now. It's still a truism, I think, that for most poets the work dies with them and they're no longer producing. I am always chastened when I walk into a used bookstore and go to the poetry section, and I'm surrounded by volumes gathering dust written by poets who in their heyday won everything but the Statue of Liberty, and now no one knows their names or reads their work. So there has to be something about the work that keeps it alive, a combination of, I think, some merit and a good deal of luck.
So let me ask you this. Even if that kind of immortality is impossible for a poet, is the life of the poet still worth it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we make a contribution to the community now, if we make a contribution to the world around us, if we change hearts and minds, if we change lives, if we make a difference even momentarily for a few minutes of consolation for someone who's grieving, someone who feels hopeless, then it's been worth it. Absolutely. I have been in a position in the last few years, and I think this is just a natural process of aging taking place. As I get older, my friends are starting to die off. And by this I'm referring to friends from the generation ahead of me, people in their 70s and 80s now, and they're dying off, and they're quite rapidly. So in the last few years, I've written quite a number of elegies. And of course, you write an elegy keeping in mind that you're trying to say something for the present, but also the future reader. At the same time, you are trying in the immediate moment to console. And I won't soon forget reading one of those elegies for a poet friend of mine who died, Robert Creeley, at a public event in Acton, Massachusetts, and his widow was there, and this was still very much, very fresh. It just, recently happened. And she heard the poem, and she pumped her fists in the air and came halfway out of her seat when she heard it. And there was a moment of consolation there. And I'm glad I was able to provide it, as brief as it may have been.
How did you meet Creeley? I'm very interested in how you met Creeley. And I mean, here's a poet who is part of the avant-garde for many critics. I wouldn't pigeonhole him that way, but he is considered that.
Yeah, I have wandered over some very unusual landscapes, places where I really wasn't supposed to be. And I turned up at one point at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado in July of 1984. And the reason I was there was that I had just won my first award as a poet, which was a Massachusetts Artist Fellowship. And they gave me $5,000. I had absolutely no idea what to do with it. So I bought a pair of contact lenses, which I immediately flushed down the sink. And I went to Boulder, Colorado, and spent a month there at the Naropa Institute, taking classes and workshops and meeting a rather amazing array of poets, including Allen Ginsberg and Amiri Baraka, Anne Wallman, Diane DePrima, and lo and behold, Robert Creeley. And all the relationships I formed there, the most lasting and the most meaningful was the relationship with Creeley. And this is despite the fact that aesthetically you would not necessarily see anything in common between us. You know, on the page we look like, night and day. But Bob was extraordinarily generous, very, very warm, politically very astute, very sharp guy politically, which many people don't know about him. He was, so we were close for a time in the 80s, and then we sort of drifted apart for a while, and then towards the end of his life we renewed our friendship, and again he was extremely generous, and he actually gave me an award in his name called Robert Creeley Award. The last time I saw Bob was the day after that award ceremony, when we walked together through the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts. That became part of the elegy I ultimately read for him. I can read it if you want.
Please do. Please do.
Yeah. I was also, at the time, guest editing a journal called Plowshares. And shortly after that last meeting, I asked him for some poems for the magazine, and I didn't get them for a long time. And finally, I got an email from him telling me he just couldn't write under the dreadful political circumstances of the day. And lo and behold, right in the middle of this email telling me he couldn't write a poem, there was a poem. So that too appears in this poem for Bob, and I'm quoting in the refrain here the poem that he ultimately wrote. And that also gave me the title, You Got a Song, Man, for Robert Creeley, 1926 to 2005. You told me the son of Acton's town nurse would never cross the border into Concord, where the revolution left great houses standing on Main Street. Yet we crossed into Concord, walking through Sleepy Hollow Cemetery to greet Thoreau, his stone stamped with the word Henry, jutting like a gray thumbnail down the path from Emerson and his boulder of granite. We remembered Henry's night in jail, refusing tax for the Mexican War, and I could see you hunched with him, loaning Henry a cigarette, explaining the perpetual wink of your eye lost after the windshield burst in your boyhood face. When Emerson arrived to ask what you and Henry were doing in there, you would say, "You got a song, man? Sing it. You got a bell, man? Ring it." You hurried off to Henry in his cell before the trees could bring their flowers back to Sleepy Hollow. You sent your last letter months ago about the poems you could not write. No words to sing when the president swears that God breathes the psalms of armies in his ear, and flags twirl by the millions to fascinate us like dogs at the dinner table. You apologize for what you could not say, as if the words were missing teeth you searched for with your tongue. And then a poem flashed across the page, breaking news of music, interrupting news of war. You got a song, man? Sing it. You got a bell, man? Ring it. Today you died 2,000 miles from Sleepy Hollow, somewhere near the border with Mexico, the territory Thoreau wandered only in jailhouse sleep. Your lungs folded their wings in a land of drought and barbed wire, boxcars swaying intoxicated at 4 a.m., and unexplained lights hovering in the desert. You said, "There's a lot of places out there, friend." So you would go, smuggling a suitcase of words across every border carved by the heel of map makers or conquerors, because you had an all-night conversation with the world, hearing the beat of unsung poems in every voice, visiting the haunted rooms in every face. Drive, you said, because poets must bring the news to the next town. You got a song, man? Sing it. You got a bell, man? Ring it.
That's so passionate. I mean, we have scholars here like Steve Fredman and others who have written extensively about Creeley, but they have never given me a picture of the man, as your poem gave me. This figure in American poetry, a very large figure, would have been so generous, it's kind of surprising to me, because I would have thought that he would have been more territorial, more cliquish, but he doesn't. He wasn't that way.
No, he was a rare human being. He was a rare human being, extraordinarily generous. And I have been gifted with a series of mentors outside the realm of academia. Right? Because my formal training is quite different. I got a bachelor's degree in history, and I got a Juris Doctor in law. Right? So I was not formally educated in poetry, and yet there have been many fathers for me poetically, and certainly Robert Creeley was one of them. I would add to that list Clemente Soto Vélez, great Puerto Rican poet, and a leader of the independence movement who spent 6 years in prison for his advocacy of the independence cause. I would add to that list Andrew Salke, poet from Jamaica. I would also add to that list a poet from England by the name of Adrian Mitchell. Not only a poet, but a playwright and a translator. You might be familiar with Murat Sa'd. If you've seen Murat Sa'd, then you've heard the words of Adrian Mitchell, because he was the one who translated all the verse, including the songs that we know so well from that play. So I would add him to the list. And there have been others who were not poets and yet very much mentors for me. I mentioned Herbert Hill earlier, University of Wisconsin, Steve Stern, another professor there. I would mention more recently Abe Osheroff, who was a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, fought against fascism in Spain during the Civil War, and Howard Zinn, very dear friend, who of course died very recently. So there are any number of those kinds of fathers, and I would add to that my actual father, Frank Espada, who was and remains at the age of 80 an activist, who has always provided a model for me, not only of political behavior, but artistic behavior, you might say. Because my father is a documentary photographer, as well as an activist, and the creator of something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project, which is a photo documentary and oral history of the Puerto Rican migration. And not too long ago, he published a book by that very title.
I wanted to ask you a question in relation to what you just said, but also what was said yesterday about that Paul Martinez Pompe said that your poetry allowed him to write poetry, that your voice gave permission for his voice to exist. Do you have that relationship with other poets? I mean, you've mentioned Whitman and Neruda. Would you say that they were the ones who gave you a voice, allowed you a voice?
They certainly did. But even before I discovered Whitman and Neruda, I had another kind of epiphanic experience, and several, in fact. I'll go back to one that I had when I was actually still in high school. My father gave me a book of poems, and it was not what you might expect. He gave me the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the Fitzgerald translation, and I remember being swept away not only by the philosophy and the poetry, but the music of that classic work. And so there was a kind of beginning, but particularly I remember a day when a friend of the family by the name of Luis Garden Acosta visited our house, and he knew that I was struggling with the idea of being a poet, that I had written some poetry, that I had dropped out of college, that I was not sure I was going to take up either poetry or college again. And he handed me a book. When he handed me the book, he said, prophetically, "You're going to be a poet." And I grunted at him, or something like that. But then I looked at the book, and it was called Latin American Revolutionary Poetry, from Monthly Review Press, edited by Roberto Marquez, who happens to be a Puerto Rican scholar. He now is a professor at Mount Holyoke College, and he's a good friend of mine. But I opened up this book, and it was a revelation, and there were any number of poems there that would have given me permission to write in my own voice. To begin with, there was Puerto Rican Obituary by Pedro Pietri. But there was also, right next to it, the works of major Latin American poets like Ernesto Cardenal and Nicolás Guillén. There was Cardenal's Zero Hour, his history of the Somoza dictatorship and the Sandinista resistance to it back in the 20s and 30s. And on and on and on. It was one revelation after another. And it was as if an amnesiac had discovered who his parents were. It's as if I had thought for years that I was alone. And then I realized I was part of a community, a movement, a nation, a history, a tradition. All of that came to me at once with this very, very key anthology. And the beauty of anthologies is if, you know, there are 50 poets in an anthology, and half of them strike a chord with you, well, there's 25 more books you have to find. And so off I went, and I haven't stopped searching since.
So that gift was pivotal to your development as a poet.
Absolutely.
How such a simple thing as a book can initiate a vocation.
Absolutely.
It's remarkable how something like that, or just someone that you trust, someone who has read your work, or at least sensed the possibility in your work, saying you are a poet. It's kind of like a blessing. You've been blessed.
Absolutely. And I know that it goes beyond the choice of vocation, because there are people who will say to you in all sincerity, poetry saved my life. Mm-hmm. And they're speaking literally. I think of someone like Sam Hamill, who's also a good friend of mine, who had hit bottom. Really, he was living on the street. He was a drug addict, still in his teens, and he was rescued by Kenneth Rexroth. And he was rescued by poetry. And Sam will tell you, poetry saved my life. He went on to become not only an important poet and an editor at Copper Canyon, but also one of the most important translators of our time, who taught himself classical Japanese and Chinese so he could translate the masters. That was the dedication that he demonstrated, because that was the commitment he felt he owed to poetry itself for saving his life. You'll hear that said by people who come out of the prison system, or by people who have been addicted to drugs and alcohol, people who have survived some childhood trauma. They will tell you that. Poetry saved my life. If it wasn't for this, I'd be dead. So again, we tend to minimize the power that poetry has. We tend to sort of sneer at it, and we can't forget the lives that have been saved.
I'm thinking now some more about the idea of permission. And as a teacher in the creative writing program here at the University of Notre Dame, and I'd like to hear what your experiences are in this regard. Students, at times, some students anyway, seek that permission from me. They want me to initiate them. And I find that problematic, that the teacher you're working with at that point in your life has so much authority over you. And maybe it makes more sense that someone outside the classroom is more inclined to have the authority to do that. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, we have to keep in mind that most young people have been socialized to be obedient. And they've been socialized to accept authority and to seek authority out when they don't know what to do or they don't know what to say. And they want someone to give them that guidance. Of course, that's perilous, not only for poetry, but for democracy. We have to get away from any kind of authoritarian model. We have to stop letting other people do our thinking for us and do our talking for us. We have to, in fact, grab the opportunity that writing a poem presents to us for self-expression, but for unfettered self-expression, which is not subject to the approval of any authority, whether it's teacher or priest or parent. And that's a difficult lesson to learn, and some poets take a lifetime to learn it. It's very difficult to write a poem that you know somebody else might, disapprove of, get angry at you for, take offense at, and those things do happen. And you have to be able to deal with the consequences.
The poet Rilke, in his Letters to a Young Poet, speaks of necessity. If you have the necessity to write, then you're true to yourself. You're true to your art. And I think you're speaking to that, in essence, that if you are impelled, then whatever consequences there are consequences that you have, in a sense, surrendered to, because the art has made this necessary.
We can hope that's what happens. Of course, there is a compulsion to write. There is a need to write. That need to write comes into conflict with other needs in a mercantile culture, because we have a need to eat, we have a need to pay the rent, we have a need to pay our medical bills, we have a need to pay our student loans, we have a need to make the car payments, and so on. And the fact of the matter is, in a mercantile culture, there's no price tag on a poem. So you can't turn around and trade it tomorrow for value, quote unquote. And that means that we are constantly in a battle to find the time, the energy, the commitment to write those necessary poems, because those other needs are prioritized and even glorified in this culture.
As a father myself, should I be with my son or should I be reading a book of poetry? I mean, I would rather be with my son.
This is where multitasking comes in. You know, I do perform multiple tasks.
We have to.
You have to. No.
Could you talk about your life as a teacher and the relationship between teaching and your vocation as a poet?
Well, clearly, poets teach because that's what poets are paid to do. So if a poet, or for that matter, I think any creative writer, were given the choice would be to sit and write and somehow be mysteriously subsidized. Well, the mysterious subsidies don't come to me all that often. So, you know, teaching is a way to make a living, first and foremost. Secondarily, it is a way to have health insurance, which in this day and age is no small thing. My wife is disabled, and the health insurance is essential. So let's get the pragmatics out of the way first. Now, having said that, I am constantly energized and re-energized by the experience of teaching, because I think the best teachers are also students, eternally. So I'm forever rereading and relearning the poems and the poets that I am teaching to others. That in itself makes it worth my while. But then the responses that I get, you know, and I teach not only at the University of Massachusetts, but at various workshops all across the country. Even recently, I did workshops in Mexico and in Ireland. And I'm always amazed at what people do when they respond, and, you know, the poems that they write spontaneously because I've asked them to do it, or the way they are transformed by the experience of sharing the poets that I love. You know, that is a, you know, I think poets are, most of them anyway, social animals, communal animals. We need that. We need that. And it's not just a matter of audience. It's not just a matter of reading a poem to an audience and getting applause. It's a much more complex relationship than that. You know, it has to do with this constant feeding back and forth, back and forth. You know, I've done a lot of workshops in prisons and jails, and that is always an extraordinary experience for me especially. You know, I think I take more away from it than they do.
Have you found some great poets in prison?
I think, given the epidemic of incarceration in this country, that the prison system is the greatest repository of wasted talent in our society. I can also say, because I have worked in both systems for a long time, that per capita, I believe there are more poets in the prison system than in academics. And that makes sense if you think about it. I mean, they've got a lot of time on their hands and they've got a lot to say.
Necessity.
Necessity. And they're looking for a way out. And they're looking for redemption. And they're looking for all kinds of things that all of us should be looking for. And I have found poets, you know, and of course sometimes you're dealing with a relatively low level of literacy, but I have found poets, real honest-to-God poets in the prison system. And poets who demonstrate a level of commitment that we would never dream of ordinarily. I'll read you a poem about one of those poets.
Please do.
You know, this is a poet who I met at a juvenile detention center in Boston. and his name was Brandon. And after I met him, I got the scoop, so to speak, from the assistant warden who drove me to the bus station. And so this is the poem that ultimately came out of that encounter. It's called The Poet in the Box for Brandon. We have a problem with Brandon, the assistant warden said. He's a poet. At the juvenile detention center, demonic poetry fired Brandon's fist into the forehead of another inmate. Metaphor, that cackling spirit, drove him to flip another boy's cafeteria tray onto the floor. The staccato chorus rhyming in his head told him to spit and curse at enemies bigger by 100 pounds. The gnawing in his rib cage was a craving for discipline. Repeatedly, 2 guards shuffled him to the cell called the box, solitary confinement. Masonry of silence fingered by hallucinating drifters, rebels awaiting execution, monks in prayer. Then we figured it out, the assistant warden said. He started fights, so we throw him in solitary, where he could write. The box. There, poetry was a grasshopper in the bowl of his hands, pencil chiseling letters across his notebook like the script of a pharaoh's deeds on pyramid walls. Metaphor spilled from the light he trapped in his eyelids, lamps of incandescent words. Rhyme harmonized with the voices of great-grandmothers and sharecropper blues men whenever sleep began to whistle in his breath. So the cold was a blanket to him. We fixed Brandon, the assistant warden said. We stopped punishing him. He knows that every violation means he stays here longer. Tonight, there are poets who versify vacations in Tuscany, the villa on a hill, the light of morning. Poets who stare at computer screens and imagine cockroach powder dissolved into the coffee of the committee that said no to tenure. Poets who drain whiskey bottles and urinate on the shoes of their disciples. Poets who cannot sleep as they contemplate the extinction of iambic pentameter. Poets who watch the sky, waiting for a poem to plunge in a white streak through blackness. Brandon dreams of punishment. Stealing the keys from a sleepy jailer to lock himself into the box where he can hear the scratching of his pencil like fingernails on dungeon stone.
Thank you, Martin, for reading that poem and for reminding us that talent is sometimes most ably displayed by those with few resources, but still make music out of what little they have. Thank you so much for being interviewed today, Martin.
Thank you.